welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the channel dedicated to performing an exhaustive, but hopefully not exhausting, look at every English language game released for the 8 and 16-bit Sega platforms, consisting of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And yes, I know the SG-1000 exists, but come on, have you ever seen one? I didn't think so. Unless you actually have, in which case I'm somewhat jealous, I must admit. Based on my calculations, with the few extra post-year 2000 games I'm throwing in, that comes out to about 1,275 titles, which means, if you happen to notice the episode number of today's video, that I'm officially 10% complete with this mission of madness. It's taken right at 2.5 years to get there, which is about what I expected, so steady as she goes as we delve further into this library on this 25-year mission. To the 216 loyal subscribers that have already signed on for this journey, thank you, and I hope you're enjoying yourself. Also, I had to edit that line 3 times this week because y'all keep subscribing, and that's truly the best possible problem I can have. If you're here for the first time, and this sounds like a party you want to be invited to, please think about subscribing yourself, and maybe tell a friend if you're so inclined. Okay, now that all that politeness is out of the way, let's get to our game this week, which is decidedly not polite. In fact, you might even consider it to be a bit rude. I mean, come on. Look at that cover art. Jeez, Butterbean. It's bad enough that you gave this poor dude an obviously fake black eye, but you gotta step on his neck too? Harsh. Toughman Contest, seen here in its Genesis form, is not some generic name for a fighting game. No, instead, Toughman Contest is actually the name of a fighting competition that actually goes all the way back to 1979. While they're not exactly the same, you can think of the Toughman Contest as the UFC before the UFC was the UFC. Especially when you look back at how the UFC was originally conceived, with the UFC events consisting of a single night tournament in the early days, with the fighters working their way through a ladder and fighting multiple times in one night, which is the format the Toughman Contest was built on. Nowadays, of course, the UFC has long since moved away from single-night tournaments, but I think it's safe to say that the UFC wouldn't exist without the Toughman Contest. The Toughman Contest differs from other organized competitions in several ways. Unlike the UFC or other fighting tournaments, the Toughman Contest is strictly a boxing event, with its regional events following the rules of the local sanctioning bodies, but for the most part consisting of 2-minute round, 3-round fights with standard boxing rules. Along with the tournament's focus on boxing, all of the competitors are also required to be amateurs, giving the tournament an everyman feel, allowing anyone to essentially have a chance, assuming they can pass a boxing physical. So why did Electronic Arts decide to make a game about the Toughman Contest rather than just a straight boxing game? Well, at the time, many boxing games would simply pick one boxer, pay to use their name and likeness, and then fill the rest of the game with generic other boxers. Other companies had already signed up people like Evander Holyfield, George Foreman, Muhammad Ali, etc. So I suppose EA decided, hey, people like this Butterbean guy, let's sign him up. And Toughman Contest was born. Toughman Contest, from that perspective, is clearly an original idea for a game. But is it any good? We'll take a look at that and more, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Toughman Contest, and it's in really good shape. There's some minor imperfections here and there, but for the most part the case is fully intact, and this being a EA clamshell, there was no hang tab at the top of the case to remove. The inner cover is in near perfect condition with no water or sun damage. This is exactly how this game is supposed to look. Just as a note, I'm sure some of you are probably looking at this front cover and thinking, wait, that looks awful yellow, are you sure that's how it's supposed to look? And the answer is yes. For whatever reason, they decided when creating this cover they wanted to give it sort of a yellow filter to make it look like it's an old-timey picture. I guess going with the amateur nature of the Toughman Contest. Along with that filter, it's just a very interesting cover and something that definitely stands out. This isn't just another generic sports title with a random player or team on the cover. I really like that they decided to do something a bit different, and I think that's representative of the game inside as well, as we'll get into in a bit. I also enjoyed the logo that they picked out. I'm not even sure how to describe it. as it's the name in almost a graffiti-inspired silhouette that again seems to reference the somewhat underground nature of the title. One last thing that I really like about the front cover is that it actually takes up the full space. It's not inset in some sort of border or background, and that sort of thing is not very common at all on Genesis releases. Flipping over the back, and oh boy, we got a lot going on back here. I've mentioned this before, but if you ever want to know if a game is a later release or not, you can probably tell by looking at the rear cover and seeing just how intricate, or messy as the case may be, of a graphic design that was used. Now, as much as a hot mess as this is, there are a few things I unironically appreciate back here. The first is that tagline at the top. Wimps need not apply. That's pretty ballsy, I like it. Of course, that's followed up by this fake quote from an anonymous Toughman contestant, and, well, it kind of descends into self-parody after that. I mean, look at these crazy Batman 66 style comic book sound effects. Oomph, thwack, whoosh, and adios. And if it was just those words by themselves, it wouldn't be so odd, but then they're inserted with what looks like word art style goofy warp fonts, and it doesn't really back up that tough guy mystique that they were going for at the top. However, we've got 6 great quality screenshots, each with good captions showing off most of the different arenas in the game, and just how colorful a game it is, which I'll get to more in a bit. Also, the bullet point section over the right is very solid and does a great job of selling the game's features, like the 24 different fighters, the special moves, the custom tournament, etc. It's definitely a mixed bag if I've ever seen one. Inside the case, and this copy is truly complete, as here we've got a warranty card, an EA Sports 1995 lineup promo, a quick reference card with a shot of Butterbean and 2 codes, which is nice, and then finally the manual. Real quick, 2 interesting things about this 1995 promo. If you look inside, the first page has this very game with alternate cover art, and then a curious game called Line Drive Baseball with no picture. Line Drive Baseball apparently became Triple Play 96, and I just find it interesting that they were promoting that at the same time as LaRussa Baseball 95. As far as the manual goes, it's a pretty run-of-the-mill manual, does a good job of explaining the game, but what I really like is the section at the end that gives a background to each of the fighters. Ultimately, none of this really matters, but I like that they took the time to be creative and write all these. Okay, that's the package. Let's see just how big a punch Toughman Contest packs. At the risk of stepping on the rest of the review, and really spoiling everything, I just have to come out and say that Toughman Contest might be one of the most frustrating titles I've played for Zilog and Moto so far. The reason for this is simple. I like everything about this game, except the game itself. Confused? Well, let's try to clear things up. Let's start with a little background. Toughman Contest had a bit of an unusual release when it comes to appearing on consoles to begin with. The game actually first appeared on the Mega Drive in Europe in March 1995, rather than debuting in the United States, as was the norm for most EA Sports titles. Except for stuff like Australian Rugby League or EA Hockey, both alternate versions of games that were released in the United States. Why was that? Well, I think the reason is because Toughman Contest isn't exclusive to the Genesis, and in fact got a 32X release as well that we'll cover down the line. That 32X version hit the market in June of 1995 in the United States, and then the Genesis version was finally released a month later. Why didn't EA simply hold the European release to go with the United States one? No idea, but I can only assume that Europe wasn't as concerned with promoting the 32X at that point, so they felt like it made no sense to not have a finished game on the market. As far as release dates go, those are a bit less important to the game as they were to other boxing titles at the time, specifically ones that feature boxers by name, like James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing, or Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing, because with the lead time involved with making a boxing game based around a certain champion, that champion may only have the title for a short while before losing it to someone else, destroying the marketing for the game. Think about it. As a kid, would you want to pick up a game with a boxer's name on it that was just destroyed on national TV? As much as the marketing of the game was certainly based around Eric Butterbean Esch, and his somewhat improbable success in the Toughman Contest, the game doesn't have his name on it. Less people would know that he wasn't the Toughman champion at the time, just due to the underground nature of the event, and some of his more noteworthy public appearances, such as those with the WWE, wouldn't occur until years after the release of the game. Speaking of that underground nature, Toughman Contest is certainly not a game that should be considered a straight boxing simulation, and I think that's fitting for an event such as this. If you noticed in the pictures on the back of the case, from a strictly design perspective, Toughman Contest looks to be a tribute to the original arcade version of Punch-Out!, which makes even more sense when you realize that the Super Nintendo sequel, Super Punch-Out!, was released less than a year before in September of 1994. Now, full disclosure, I've never been a fan of Punch-Out! Or any of the games in that series. When Super Punch-Out! Came out, it was a huge game, and I remember all my friends talking about it when it came out. I did own a Super Nintendo at the time, so I gave it a rental when I had a chance, and it just wasn't for me. Very similar to the Toughman Contest, I love the concept of Super Punch-Out!, and I played it a lot during that 3-day period, but it just never clicked. Keep that in mind for the rest of the review, because if you do like the Punch-Out! Games, and obviously there's plenty of people out there that do, your opinions might be wildly different than mine when I get to the gameplay portion. One of the things that you can say about the Toughman Contest, possibly borrowed from the Punch-Out! Series, is a cast of colorful characters. But rather than just playing as a somewhat generic underdog in Little Mac, Toughman Contest gives you the ability to choose any of the 24 boxers from 4 different regions. Each of the boxers has a unique look, and with no weight divisions, certain fighters are smaller and shredded, and then others are massive mountains of men. Along with the individual looks, each character is rated in one of 4 categories: strength, speed, stamina, and recovery. So, depending on your playstyle, you can select a character that most fits your approach to the game. 24 is a lot of boxers, and you can tell there was a lot of creativity put into this aspect of the game. And I appreciate that, as when I reviewed Muhammad Ali boxing back in episode 103, there were only 10 fighters in that game, and the aforementioned Super Punch-Out! Only had 17, and that's counting Rick and Nick Bruiser as separate characters. Since the game is not limited to the constraints of the real world, Toughman Contest has expanded the tournament aspect of the championship from a region perspective. Rather than fighters fighting in regional tournaments across the United States for a spot in the eventual Toughman Championship final in Las Vegas, now the fighters are from all over the world, with regional tournaments based around the United States, Central and South America, Europe and the Middle East, and finally Asia and Oceania. To go along with each of these regions, there's colorful matching backgrounds to fight in that fit the region, and then of course a separate glitzy championship backdrop on the Vegas Strip. I really like how the game has these different areas to fight in, as even more modern combat sports games can get caught up in just throwing the combatants in a generic-looking ring and arena, giving the game a feel of just doing the same thing over and over and over again. Along with the expected full Toughman Contest mode, the game also features an exhibition mode that allows you to experiment with choosing between different fighters to see who you like the best, and to potentially practice against opponents before going up against them in the tournament. Also, exhibition mode can be set to be 2-player, so that you and a friend can pick a fighter and knock each other around. I like any time that there's at least an option for 2 players. I'm not exactly sure how well it works in this scenario, considering how the camera is behind the head of the first player, rather than a traditional left versus right display, but hey, at least it's an option. Finally, there's also a custom tournament mode that allows you to put together your own Toughman Contest tournament for up to 8 people in case you've got a party going on. From a graphical perspective, Toughman Contest is a 32 megabit cartridge, and it looks every bit of it. I referred earlier to the fact that you can fight in 5 different colorful areas, but it's not just that the backdrops are colorful. There's lots of nice details as well, such as the bare-knuckle fight going on at the bar in the Latin American area, and the roaring lions at the Coliseum. And as nice as those backdrops are, they're only secondary to the fighters, which are huge and animated very well. In fact, they may be some of the largest characters that appear on the Genesis, which actually has some limitations on sprite size that they must have creatively programmed around. The presentation here is certainly top-notch, and it looks like a late-release Genesis title. While the sound isn't quite as impressive as the graphics, it's not bad at all, and you might call it above average.
The soundtrack to the game is upbeat and is all quality. There's not that many different songs, and the music doesn't play during fights except for breaks between rounds, but what is there is certainly enjoyable. Where the game shines, however, is in the sound effects department. There's not much speech other than the announcer counting to 10 on a knockdown, but the other effects that are included are a great mix of various thwacks, cracks, and thumps that make the game feel lively and fit well with the fighting nature of the game. The only even mediocre aspect of the sound design is the audience cheering, which could probably be a little less generic, but I've certainly heard worse. Based on everything I've said so far, you're probably wondering, okay, well, he said at the top that he likes everything about the game, but the game, and he hasn't really complained about anything yet, so where's the catch? Well, I'll tell you. I mentioned before that I wasn't crazy about the Punch-Out series, and clearly Toughman Contest draws some inspiration from Punch-Out. But I didn't really mention what I didn't like about Punch-Out. To me, Punch-Out comes down to memorizing patterns. Many times when you're fighting someone, you essentially have to wait for the computer to do something, and then based on what the computer does, either dodge or attack, and then rinse and repeat. And I get why some people would like that, especially with sort of the strategic aspect of that gameplay, but I simply don't have the patience to memorize attack patterns and responses, as I prefer to be a bit more offensive. Toughman Contest certainly doesn't specifically copy that, but there are definitely similarities in having to attempt to block or avoid the computer's attacks and follow with counters. And don't get me wrong, I don't feel like I should just be able to button mash and win a fight, but having to sit back and be patient and counter all the time, especially the further you get into the tournament, isn't for me, and it's the same reason I'm not crazy about chess. I'd be more forgiving about the gameplay if it was more like Punch-Out and I felt like the mechanics of the game were dead on. But, and maybe with more time and dedication I could figure this out, the fighting actions seem random at times. What I mean by this is that during certain punches, most commonly uppercuts and hooks, I'll throw the punch and then my fighter will just sit there for a second or two, frozen. Other times, the fighter will reset as normal, and I can't figure out if this is due to missing a punch and that pause is a penalty, but it just feels really odd. Also, one of the major selling points of the game is the special attack system that relies on hitting the B button and then tapping a specific button combination, and this just feels weird. I love the idea of being able to customize your character's special attacks, and that there are 14 of them to choose from, but hitting B and then tapping a direction is just awkward. I would expect to hit B to throw the punch as the last part of the combination, and not the first. Unfortunately, Toughman Contest ends up being possibly the most frustrating game I've played on Zilog and Moto to date, as I mentioned at the top. There are all the makings of a great game here, as not only did they get a lot of the major things right about the game, there's also nice small details, like being able to check on fight stats after a round or the match. Get advice from your corner, although I don't know how accurate it is. Get updates on other fights, the text intro from the announcer that sets up the fight, instant replay, etc. But then there's also other serious issues, like all of the aforementioned control quirkiness, and something I hadn't touched on at all, but the lack of battery backup in a 1995 game, and instead a very long password system that thankfully self-populates after a loss, but Lord help you if you turn off the game. As a result, I'm chickening out a bit, which I think is fitting for a game called Toughman Contest, and giving Toughman Contest 2 stars, but with a few caveats. Honestly, for myself, I might only give the game 1 star, as I can't get beyond the 4th fight in any of the brackets without cheating. But I also recognize that Punch-Out fans may view this game very differently than me, and for someone that really gets and appreciates the combat system, they might give it a much better rating.
And that was Toughman Contest for the Genesis. This is one of those times when I recognize that a game may just not be for me, rather than specifically being bad. So I think it's right to officially give it a mediocre rating, even though my personal opinion is that while it has plenty of technical merit, it was ultimately frustrating for me to play instead of fun, which usually results in a worse rating. Definitely let me know in the comments below if you disagree, and I'm very curious if when I come back to the 32X version in a few years, if my opinion will have changed at all. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's a sports sequel on the Genesis, but Probably not one that you're expecting, as it's somewhat of an obscure release. I know nothing about it other than I didn't know it existed before I started this collection, and the previous game in the series was a whole lot of eh. So I'm really hoping that perhaps they fix some of those issues with that previous title, rather than just slapping a year on the end of it and re-releasing the same old game. We shall see. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.